On September the 7th, 1978, Georgi Markov, a Bulgarian living in London, was traveling to work. Following his usual routine, he left his car and crossed Waterloo Bridge. He had no idea that on this day, he was being watched. As Markov waited for a bus, he felt something sting his leg. He turned to see a man picking up an umbrella and running away. What seemed at first like a curious accident turned into an extraordinary detective story when 3 days later, Markov died.
It seemed to me a reasonable way of actually committing the perfect murder.
The incident became legendary because of the murder weapon. It's one of the strangest tales of the Cold War, peppered with poisons, political intrigue, and ingenious gadgets.
This was espionage, assassination, sort of almost something rather James Bondish about this.
But at its heart, it's the story of the murder of an innocent man, an act of petty spite carried out by a ruthless dictatorship. Nearly 30 years on, the perpetrators of this crime have never been brought to justice.
The clues were present, but the proof was missing.
Yet hidden in the Bulgarian state archives are crucial documents that reveal the full story of Georgi Markov's assassination. People who know the prime suspect still fear for their safety.
He still lives here and come and go. And he's a nomad.
This investigation takes us to the heart of the Cold War's most notorious murder, and to the identity of the man who killed Georgi Markov. When Georgi Markov checked himself into hospital at 9 p.m. on September the 8th, 1978, he was convinced something was wrong. In Casualty, they were skeptical of his bizarre story. It's a night the young doctor on duty, Bernard Riley, will never forget.
It had been said in a rather humorous manner. In Cubicle 1, we have someone who's had a heart attack. In Cubicle 2, we have a road traffic accident case. And in Cubicle 3, there's a man who's been shot by the KGB. No one was taking him seriously. In fact, I remember the look in his eyes. He was desperate for someone to listen to him and believe him.
Markov's conspiracy theory made the doctors doubt his sanity.
When I first saw him, he was fully conscious. He was feverish, had a high temperature, and he had signs of what could have been a simple infection like influenza. He was complaining of nausea and vomiting, but he was also pointing to an area on his right thigh, which he said was swollen and painful, but it could have been anything from an insect bite to being stabbed with a sharp metal object.
Markov worked at the BBC World Service. Among his friends and colleagues there, he had a reputation for telling tall stories.
He was larger than life, and he used to boast quite a lot. For example, he boasted that he could catch a fly in mid-flight. He also boasted that he'd played football for the Bulgarian national team. And we always thought this was Georgi shooting a line, but it turned out it was true. I actually saw him catch flies in mid-flight. Don't like this. Don't ask me how he did it.
Markov was an enigmatic character who lived most of his life in Bulgaria, isolated from the West under one of the most paranoid communist regimes in Eastern Europe. Bulgaria was Russia's closest political ally, and its leader, President Todor Zhivkov, was a die-hard communist.
За тържеството на комунистическите идеи, за мирното, щастливо бъдеще на нашите деца, за изпълнение на партийната програма, за развито социалистическо общество на нашето скъпо отечество. Закривам 10-тия конгрес на Българската комунистическа партия.
Despite the restrictions of the communist system, Georgi Markov became one of Bulgaria's most acclaimed writers in the 1960s. He was so influential, the president invited him on hunting weekends with other leading intellectuals. Markov enjoyed a privileged life, until he began speaking out against the repressive regime. In 1969, when the authorities tried to stifle him by banning one of his novels and closing his plays, he decided to defect to the West.
I don't want to say that I am braver or more honest than other people. Perhaps if I were more honest, I should have been there, because if you're honest, you should stay there and fight the battle there, not being here. I think in a way it was kind of, when you say in England, I'm fed up, and you just go away.
Like many other defectors from the Eastern Bloc, Markov came to London seeking sanctuary. He found work as a translator at the BBC, and then married Annabel Dilk in 1975. The following year, they had a daughter. But a dark shadow started to creep over Markov's life. He began to receive ominous phone calls from Bulgaria. His former country liked to warn him that his treachery would be punished.
They threatened to poison him and told Georgi that there was a phial of poison in the Bulgarian consulate or Bulgarian legation in Munich, which was actually named for Georgi. But again, we took that really as a rather exaggerated story, I'm afraid to say.
2 days after the attack on Waterloo Bridge, what at first seemed like a Cold War fantasy was now treated seriously as his condition deteriorated. When he was transferred to intensive care, his friend David Phillips came to visit him.
I shook hands with him when I left him, and his hand was stone cold, really like a dead person's hand. And they immediately took his blood pressure, which was down almost to zero.
Markov's doctors were fighting to save his life.
He developed an irregular heartbeat at 7:45 in the morning and essentially had a cardiac arrest. It was obvious that we were never going to get a stable heart rhythm, and his metabolism was so deranged that death was inevitable, and we stopped resuscitation after 45 minutes.
At 10:40 a.m. on September the 11th, 1978, Georgi Markov was pronounced dead. When the police discovered Markov was a defector, they immediately launched an investigation. Scotland Yard's anti-terrorist branch began to realize the bizarre story he had been telling might be true after all.
A taxi driver, according to the deceased, was seen to take away a person.
Do you have any sort of description of this person now?
None at all. No, we've come up with an absolute blank.
The police couldn't find any eyewitnesses of the attack on Waterloo Bridge. All they had to go on was Markov's own account, which his widow Annabel repeated in an interview shortly afterwards.
He told me that he'd been jabbed with an umbrella tip. It was almost as if he didn't want to believe it himself, and I don't think he wanted to frighten me with it, but he showed me the mark that the umbrella had made.
What was it like?
It was like the point of a hypodermic.
The British press seized upon the detail of the umbrella, and the story became front-page news. It was about to turn into one of the biggest international mysteries of the decade. Within hours of Georgi Markov's mysterious death, the story of his attack on Waterloo Bridge was broadcast around the world.
Commander Neville, head of Scotland Yard's anti-terrorist branch, said it was clear that death was not due to natural causes. He said the Yard and other branches were treating the case as one of death under suspicious circumstances.
But in Markov's home country, Bulgaria, the news of his death was censored. His cousin Luban, who still lives next to the little house where they grew up, can remember how the family eventually heard the news.
Nothing was mentioned officially or in the media. I heard about it from friends. I always knew that the state wouldn't let Georgi get away with his life.
Markov's family had good reason to suspect that the Bulgarian government might be involved. Since his defection in 1969, Markov had been declared an enemy of the state.
After 1969, his name ceased to exist. He wasn't even mentioned. They removed his books from the libraries. They even scratched his name out of the credits of his films.
Markov retaliated with his own form of revenge. He started writing scripts criticizing President Zhivkov on Radio Free Europe, an American station broadcasting into the Eastern Bloc. He mocked Zhivkov, calling him a minor dictator with a second-rate sense of humor. Despite attempts to jam the signal, half the population of Bulgaria still managed to listen to these programs.
He captured the primitivism and snobism of Zhivkov. He showed the ambitions of a mediocre man, an ill-educated, unintelligent man.
When Dimitar Botchev first heard of Markov's death, he immediately suspected foul play.
This happened exactly on the birthday of Todor Zhivkov. I don't believe this was a coincidence. Zhivkov had given himself a birthday present.
Back in London, the police questioned Markov's doctors to try to establish the cause of death. His symptoms were too complex to be caused by a simple infection. They were beginning to suspect he really had been poisoned.
His blood pressure started to fall, his temperature dropped, and his white count rose. And all of those things indicate severe septic shock. He had been given the appropriate therapy to cover a wide spectrum of bacteria that could cause this and had not responded. And I was beginning to think about what else it could be. I really started to think that he might have, could have been a snake venom, sort of a pit viper venom or something like that.
To begin the murder inquiry, the police needed evidence that he had been poisoned. 24 hours after Markov's death, an autopsy was carried out to look for further clues. The poison had left no trace in Markov's bloodstream, but it had affected all of his major organs, as pathologist Rufus Crompton discovered.
There were definitely relevant changes in a large number of organs, mainly hemorrhages and lymph glands in the groin on the right-hand side, which is the side the puncture mark was on, was swollen. This suggested to me that something had gone into the back of his leg, which had travelled in the lymph up to the lymph glands and had there caused a reaction.
The swollen lymph glands indicated that Markov's body had been fighting an extremely powerful poison. Crompton's next problem was how to preserve the evidence around the wound on Markov's thigh.
I was wondering whether to cut into the puncture mark and down through it, and then I thought, well, no, there may be something in there apart from poisons. There may be, for instance, the tip of a needle or something, and I may well do more harm than good by poking around in it.
Scotland Yard decided that the tissue around the wound should be handled by specialists. The laboratory they chose was synonymous with the mysterious world of poisons and Cold War spy cases. Porton Down.
I think the fact that this was espionage or assassination, and there was an international flavour to it, you know, sort of almost there's something rather James Bondish about this. And Porton Down would be the right people to deal with that.
Porton Down was one of the most secret research centres in Britain, specialising in biochemical weapons. The laboratory now took over the poisons investigation, bringing in experts from all over the world. One was a chemical weapons specialist from the CIA, Christopher Green.
My specialty as an intelligence officer was to study foreign advances in chemical and biological terrorism and chemical warfare.
Green was at Porton Down when the team examining Markov's flesh wound made an astonishing breakthrough.
Sections of the tissue were being sliced, and the prosector's knife blade struck something that he felt was metal, initially thinking that it was a needle, but a small plink sound occurred, and it was very easy to see that it was a very tiny round ball bearing that looked like it came from the tip of a ballpoint pen.
Intrigued by this latest find, Scotland Yard brought the pellet back to London for the ballistics lab to investigate.
I'd never seen anything like it before. I don't think anybody else had. I was asked to examine it, to find out what it was made of, to investigate its nature, to produce some good quality photographs in the electron microscope.
When Porton Down examined and cleaned the pellet, they could find no traces of poison. Now as Keeley placed it under the microscope, he found the tiny object extremely hard to handle.
One had to be very careful that it didn't whiz out and disappear. I mean, it did several times for me. And I had to get down on my hands and knees with a big beaker of water and sweep up all the dust off the floor, put it in the water, and finally, and much to my relief, the pellet dropped out with a satisfying ping and hit the bottom of the beaker.
The electron microscope showed that the pellet was made of platinum iridium, an inert alloy probably chosen so that the body wouldn't reject it. The intriguing revelation was that it contained two tiny holes.
The pellet itself was harmless. It clearly wasn't the pellet that killed him, it was what was in those holes.
The two holes formed a well for the poison that would pass into Markov's bloodstream. The pellet was probably sealed with a gelatinous coating to retain the poison. When it was fired, it passed through the clothes and into the flesh. It's thought the body heat melted the coating, releasing the poison into the bloodstream.
There may have been some sugary material, a waxy material, or whatever, which would dissolve or break up, and allowing the material to release.
The well holes in Markov's pellet were empty, so it was not possible to identify the poison. Just as the investigation seemed to be stalling, there was an unexpected breakthrough. News filtered through of a similar attack in Paris. 2 weeks before Markov's attack, another Bulgarian had felt something sting him in the back. This time, however, the victim had survived to tell the tale.
Right, it's about here. At that moment, after we'd come out into the light, just before we got off the escalator, I felt something hit me in my back. I turned around, thinking it must have been thrown from the balcony behind me.
After his attack, Vladimir Kostov saw someone running away, but he saw no sign of an umbrella. Shortly afterwards, he fell ill with exactly the same symptoms as Georgi Markov.
When I realized that the pain wasn't going away, that's when I decided to go and see a doctor. And I began to think about what had happened.
Kostov had a raging temperature, and was given a variety of medications. But after 48 hours, he began to recover. When he heard about the attack on Georgi Markov 2 weeks later, he became frightened. Like Markov, Kostov was also a defector, and he too had been receiving mysterious death threats. He immediately got in touch with Scotland Yard, who were amazed to hear his story. Could there still be a pellet inside him, containing traces of the poison? After a small operation on September the 25th, a section of flesh from Kostov's back was rushed to London for examination that night.
The anti-terrorist squad phoned and said, look, can you stand by in the lab this evening? We've got some French police officers coming over from Paris, and we think they've got an identical pellet. And they came in with a piece of body tissue taken from Kostov's back. It was about as big as your thumb. And we x-rayed it, and there in the tissue was this little sphere, and we cut it, and there was a silvery pellet.
There was no trace of poison left inside this pellet either. So how did Kostov manage to survive? The police had a theory. Kostov had been wearing a heavy sweater on the day that he was attacked in Paris. Perhaps the pellet did not penetrate as deeply, so less poison reached the bloodstream. Although Kostov's case did not provide any direct help identifying the poison, the scientists now had 2 intricately made pellets to examine.
To identify what was in those, first of all, you say, well, how much was there? So in order to do that, you've got to carefully measure the dimensions of the holes and calculate the volume.
The holes could only contain 0.2 of a milligram of poison. This was a minuscule amount, 10 times smaller than the lethal dose of cyanide. It was clear that they were dealing with something terrifyingly powerful, and there were only a handful of poisons with this particular profile.
High on the list were poisons like plutonium, abrin, ricin, some snake venoms, and some other things, even like very purified botulinum. But that didn't appear to be the set of poisons that were highest on the list as abrin and ricin, which were known to be particularly dangerous if injected into the bloodstream.
Both ricin and abrin can kill in microscopic amounts. Spreading from the site of injection, the poisons attack cells and cause vital organs to shut down. But abrin is extremely rare, so the information was all pointing in one direction.
The fact that those lymph glands were swollen in the groin, and when I cut into them, they were full of hemorrhage. When I saw small hemorrhages throughout the other organs in the body, especially in the heart, and that also fitted in. And so they sort of looked at each other and said, right, ricin.
Ricin is a natural product of a number of plant materials, but most notably in high concentration in something called the castor bean. And in fact, castor oil, which is an oil from the castor bean, is completely safe to take. But when the molecule is purified, it happens to be probably one of the top 1 or 2 or 3 toxic materials known to man by weight.
There was plenty of data on the effects of castor bean poisoning, but this was the first known case of someone injected with concentrated ricin. In order to prove that this really was the poison that killed Georgi Markov, the Porton-bound team decided to use an animal test subject.
The only way to really come to a definite conclusion was to do a biological experiment. So they got a pig, which is the same size and weight, well, the same weight as Markov. The pig was injected with ricin, roughly the same amount that could have gone into the pellet, and it became seriously ill and eventually died. And they then examined the organs in the pig and found almost identical changes to those in Markov. So I concluded that this was a toxemia, in other words, a poisoning of the blood.
But if the poison was ricin, who could have produced it. The Bulgarians on their own were not technically capable of manufacturing this lethal toxin. The finger of suspicion was now pointing at Bulgaria's big brother, the Soviet Union. By early 1979, the team investigating Georgi Markov's mysterious murder still had no leads on the identity of the assassin. What they had established for certain was that the death had been caused by ricin. This rare poison was so difficult to manufacture in purified form that suspicion immediately fell on the Russians.
We knew that for many years, the Soviet laboratories had specifically been doing research on ricin, that the laboratories that the KGB acquired information from in the former Soviet Union were the laboratories that were associated with state-sponsored chemical and biological warfare research. So there was ample reason for them to be leaders in this research. We knew that.
If Russia had produced the poison, there was good reason to believe they supplied the weapon too. In a secret location in Florida is a black museum which houses the most comprehensive collection of spy gadgets from the Cold War. Many of the prized objects in this shrine to the KGB come from a clandestine weapons laboratory known as Number 12.
The technicians in Laboratory 12 would specifically be the biochemists. They would be doctorate-level graduates of Moscow University with advanced degrees. They would be individuals who were passionately working on biological warfare.
Having studied the Russian Secret Service for many years, Melton feels that the attack on Georgi Markov bears all the hallmarks of a KGB assassination.
The Russian intelligence service has learned from the very beginning that assassinations are best done if they can be quiet and unnoticed and appear natural. They wanted something that gave the target a plausible reason to believe indeed this was an accident. The question is, at what point would you make the attack? Would you do it when he's getting out of a car? Would you do it when he's walking up steps, which would be extremely difficult? Or would you do it when he's standing at a bus stop? While he's in the queue, he's stationary. Now, the one common thing that is always unnoticed in London would be umbrellas. He could logically be jabbed or prodded in an accidental way by another traveler or passerby. Within 24 to 48 hours, the person would die. The appearance would be a heart attack. And when they put all these factors together, an umbrella became the likely solution, and it's the one they selected.
Through his Russian contacts, Keith Melton has acquired a number of secret assassination devices for his collection. His most prized exhibit is a KGB umbrella gun.
This is a cutaway model of the type that I believe was used in the assassination of Georgi Markov. And it started as a conventional commercial umbrella, but it has several modifications. The button which you would normally release the umbrella is actually the firing trigger. Once it's depressed, it releases gas stored in this cylinder, which is injected into this chamber, which forces a tiny pellet out through the tip.
No murder weapon was ever found near the scene of the crime, but forensic scientists also suspected KGB involvement.
The evidence that this was the Bulgarian service acting with technology that came from Russian laboratories was circumstantial evidence. But the circumstantial evidence added together was very powerful. The clues were present, but the proof was missing.
That proof was locked behind the Iron Curtain and would remain so as long as the Cold War continued. By the end of 1979, the investigation into Markov's murder had ground to a halt. For 10 years, the case lay dormant. Then came the collapse of communism. In February 1990, 3 months after the fall of the Berlin Wall, it was Bulgaria's turn to celebrate. With riots spreading across the capital, Markov's nemesis, President Todor Zhivkov, was deposed and placed under house arrest on charges of corruption. After nearly half a century of communist rule, one of the most secretive countries in Eastern Europe began opening itself up to outside scrutiny. Jack Hamilton was one of the first Western journalists to move to the new Bulgaria. When he arrived in the country, there was great hope that the Georgi Markov case might now be solved.
In 1990, the British thought that this was an opportunity to open up the case and to start working with the Bulgarians. What the British investigation needed was information from the archives of the Bulgarian Foreign Intelligence Service, the former state security. Everyone knew or assumed that the Bulgarian authorities were behind this murder, but who had actually committed it was completely unknown.
One of Jack's first assignments in Bulgaria was at a press conference given by the former president Todor Zhivkov shortly after his release from house arrest. Jack was the only journalist that dared to ask him about the Georgi Markov case.
Zhivkov made a joke about it. He made a joke about the umbrella, which made me very angry. Well, I remember when I asked the question, there was a sort of stir. The fact that I was asking the man who was responsible for what happened, the former dictator.
Todor Zhivkov would never admit his role in the Georgi Markov murder, and he died shortly after this. However, the new post-communist government opened their own investigation into the murder in 1991. After years of disappointment for Markov's family, there seemed to be a glimmer of hope. Jack is traveling to meet the policeman who took on the case, Bogdan Karyatov. For a brief period, Karyatov was given access to archives from the communist era. He discovered crucial documents which proved conclusively that Markov had been a target of Bulgarian state security.
We discovered that Markov's name first appears in the official records in 1974. We found Markov's card index record, which said his code name was Skitnik. That means tramp.
Markov's dossier contained tantalizing clues about how communist intelligence planned to deal with him.
We found a document in the archive of the Foreign Intelligence Department, which said there were plans for Georgi Markov to be neutralized. That's exactly how it was written, neutralized. But we couldn't find out what the plans were because the relevant documents had disappeared. Someone had disposed of the documents illegally. They'd been destroyed.
The loss of this crucial evidence was a major setback in Bogdan Karyatov's investigation. The man who confessed to burning the Markov documents was General Vladimir Todorov, a former head of state security during the communist period. Todorov fled to Moscow, but eventually returned to Bulgaria to face trial. He was jailed for 16 months, but was released 6 months later. Todorov is still alive, and Jack has tracked him down to an association for former state security officers.
Добрий день.
Добър ден.
Може ли да говоря с генерал Тодоров?
Утре сутринта. Вие кой сте?
Казвам се Джон Хамилтън.
Случая за мен и асоциацията е приключил окончателно. Всичко, което е имало да се каже, го е казал вече и повече не желая да го безпокоят. Има, но много години вече ги разпъват по тези въпроси. Те са възрастни хора, просто им се занимават. Това са хора над 80 години, занимават с тези въпроси.
Todorov's mysterious flight to Moscow may also explain why he removed the Markov files. As a high-ranking intelligence officer during Bulgaria's communist era, he worked alongside the KGB for his entire career. Todorov was a go-between when the KGB supplied the weapon and poison to the Bulgarians.
Todorov destroyed those documents because the entire Bulgarian state security was incredibly closely linked to the Russian KGB.
The KGB have never admitted publicly to their role in Markov's murder. As for Vladimir Todorov, his military status meant that he was never fully interrogated by police investigator Bogdan Karyatov. Although so much evidence had disappeared, Karyatov unearthed a crucial dossier that would blow the case wide open again. The documents not only confirmed that Markov was a target, they also named the individual chosen to carry out the killing.
We found the name of an agent working for the Bulgarian intelligence service in the documents. He was based in Denmark and had been assigned to deal with Markov. The documents said that the agent was codenamed Piccadilly, and he'd been given instructions about dealing with Georgi Markov. He was living in Denmark under the name Gullino, Francesco Gullino.
Francesco Gullino was an Italian petty criminal who was arrested in Bulgaria on smuggling charges in 1971. After Bulgarian state security persuaded him to work for them, Gullino posed as an art dealer in Copenhagen, traveling around Europe in a caravan. The files confirmed that Gullino had made several trips to London, right up to the time of Markov's death.
He was sent from Denmark to England for 40 days in 1977 and stayed close to the house where Markov lived.
This was the breakthrough that the British police had been hoping for. Scotland Yard received the Gullino dossier from Bogdan Karyatov. Together, they were able to track down Francesco Gullino in Copenhagen, and he was brought in for questioning. In February 1993, unknown to the outside world, the police of Britain, Bulgaria and Denmark interrogated Gullino about his work for Bulgarian state security and his involvement in the Markov case. The police tried to keep the interrogation top secret, but the story was leaked to Danish journalist Ola Damkjær.
I had a tip here in Copenhagen that there was an Italian guy involved in the Markov case, and he had been charged with espionage. But the interesting thing is that apparently they were lacking evidence. So they gave up the case, and he was free to leave. I mean, he left for Hungary, so they didn't try to keep him back. It could be that it could be somehow embarrassing for the Danish authorities if there was a court case and Mr. Gullino told what he actually had been doing in Denmark since '74, how he was allowed to come here, but that's speculation. But you can speculate about a lot of things because it was during the Cold War.
It appears that Gullino was released because the necessary documents were not presented in time. The authorities have stopped looking for Gullino, even though the case remains unsolved. But Jack is about to find surprising clues to the whereabouts of the prime suspect. After his interrogation in 1993, Francesco Gullino, the prime suspect in the Georgi Markov case, disappeared without trace. The authorities made no further efforts to track him down, but journalist Jack Hamilton has located several people that knew Gullino in Copenhagen.
People are not really keen to speak about him at all. I think they're perhaps frightened to talk about the fact that they knew him and what he was like. I have found one person who has agreed to speak to me about Francesco Gullino, but he's also very frightened and concerned not to be identified.
Jack's source has known Gullino on and off for over 15 years. They first met when Gullino owned a picture framing business.
How did you feel when this news came out that Francesco Gullino, who you knew, was said to be connected with Georgi Markov's death?
I was shocked. And
what did he say about it?
Okay, of course I asked him, but he couldn't understand that a secret service could do things like that because he was only a small man, a little man. And we don't speak more about it.
Well, what does he do now, today? But is he alive?
Yes. Common friends meet him sometimes. And he still live here and come and go. I don't have. I don't want to have any trouble.
No one is looking for Francesco Gullino anymore, but Jack has found sightings of him all over Europe. A wire service reported his arrest on the German border in 2002. The chief suspect in the umbrella murder seems to be alive and well.
I've even spoken to an art dealer who said he saw him here in Copenhagen as recently as 2 years ago. This is amazing. It seems that Gullino is working and travelling throughout Europe, and the authorities don't appear to be interested in him at all.
Francesco Gullino has never commented on the allegations connecting him to the murder of Georgi Markov. Jack tried to approach Gullino through his contacts in Copenhagen, but everyone is too afraid to help. The murder of Georgi Markov is still an open investigation in Britain, and Scotland Yard refuses to comment on the current status of the case. But the Bulgarians did agree to an interview with their police investigator in Sofia. Andres Fatanov has suspended all work on the Bulgarian investigation, citing lack of evidence.
This is the entire Markov case.
Тези са от 92-та. Досие от 90-та. Те разберете
80% of the documents point to the account that Markov was killed by a Bulgarian state security agent or someone who worked for them. It's all pointing towards that account. More than 80% in that direction. But we need 100%. Under our law, every doubt has to be in the interest of the accused. Proof has to be beyond reasonable doubt.
But perhaps there's another reason for the Bulgarians' reluctance to move forward. There is a statute of limitations on the case which runs out in September 2008. After this time, the investigation will be closed forever.
Unfortunately, that's how it's decided in our law. In the case of this crime, the statute of limitations is 30 years. Even if the suspect is found, he can't be prosecuted in our courts if the statute has run out.
Today there is no sign that the necessary documents will ever be released in Bulgaria to solve the case. The country is now applying for membership of the European Union, and reopening the Georgi Markov case would be politically embarrassing for them.
I think they're just trying to forget their past. Joining the EU hasn't meant in Bulgaria facing up to what the communist regime did. They feel that looking into these things would be painful and distracting for them, and there's no political will to do that at all.
Even if no individual is ever brought to trial, Vladimir Kostov, the other poison pellet victim, still feels that the Bulgarian government should publicly acknowledge the crimes of the communist era.
Je ne cherche rien.
I don't seek anything. I'm not looking for the person who fired the shot into me or into Markov. Perhaps it's the same person. I'm not looking for the person who ordered it either. I understand very well that it was a political matter, so it should be treated as a political matter. It's not about blaming an individual who simply executed orders and obeyed the laws of a regime. It's about getting rid of this poisoned legacy of the Cold War.
Markov's family hoped that one day the Bulgarian government will admit that Georgi Markov was the victim of a political assassination. Yet 30 years on, the authorities remain silent, and the family continues to live with the quiet frustration of an unresolved murder. For Markov's cousin, Luban, the only solution can come from the Bulgarian state.
The
names aren't important. The finger that did it isn't important. But the mind that thought it up is.